As we continue our reading of the book of Genesis, we experience stories of God's encounters with humanity in the beginning of time. Last week we met Noah. We remembered the story of God flooding the world and the question that each one of us has asked: where is God in the midst of suffering and devastation? And as Noah encounters God in the flood and in the recreation of the world, we remember that God shows up. God preserves life and offers us peace even as we suffer. That we also show up, joining God in the work of building spaces of refuge for those who are hurting and lost, because that is what God has done for us. Now, Noah has some more ups and downs in his life because none of these characters in Genesis are perfect. They are humans who are loved by God despite their flaws or failures. But today we skip a few generations past Noah. Noah had 3 sons who had sons who had sons, and 8 generations later, Terah had 3 sons: Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Abram was married to his wife Sarai, and Sarai longed for a child, but she couldn't. She was unable to conceive, but they had each other. And Abram was born into a big family with several generations all living together, so there was plenty of family to share life with. Each morning, they all woke up in Abram's father's home. Each day, they worked alongside one another. And every night they went to bed under the big starry sky. And this went on season after season, year after year. The years passed, and Abram and Sarai grew older. The family left their home and moved the family to Haran. Not quite home, but they settled together. Eventually, Abram's dad died, and Abram became the patriarch of the family, the one who held the power and made the decisions for the entire family. And it's here in Haran, as the newly established patriarch of the family, that the Lord calls out to Abram. Go from your land and your birthplace and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and through you all of the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, this is a little bit weird because Abram had already left his birthplace and his dad has already died, but Abram went with it, so we will too. And Abram and his nephew Lot gathered their animals and their tents and just about everything they could carry. And Sarai packed up their clothes and their blankets and bundled them up, and they set off to another land. They walked and they walked and they walked. You know how a long walk can help you straighten out your thoughts? I wonder what all Abram must have worked through in his mind as they journeyed. One step after the other, left, right, falling into the rhythm with the dust below your feet, settling your mind, resting at night with the starry sky above your head. And I wonder what he heard when he wasn't listening to the responsibilities that he had left behind, instead hearing God's voice loud and clear in the silence of the wilderness. God had made big promises when he spoke to Abram. He could hear it clearly even now. Go to a new land, God said. Through your family, I will bless the whole world. How does that work when you don't have kids, when the family line stops with you? But Abram trusted God, so he kept leading his little family through the wilderness to the place where God was calling him. It was not an easy walk. This was actually quite a wild journey. First, there was a famine, so they had to go down to Egypt to wait it out. But the Pharaoh notices Sarai, so Abram lies and says that she's his sister. Only bad things start to happen to Pharaoh, and he puts it together and realizes that it started around the time that Sarai moved in. So the Pharaoh sends Abram and Sarai and their company on their way. And it was not a quiet journey. There were so many people and animals and thoughts and needs, and bickering between the households broke out. So Abram and Lot decide to part ways in order to keep the peace. But then Lot gets captured with all his possessions, so Abram has to go rescue them. But I'm sure there were some good nights in between too. Nights telling stories around the fire, shared meals, celebrations of victory and safety. Abram and Sarai followed God to this land that God had told them of. As they walked for miles and miles, they mulled over these promises that God gave them. They wondered how they fit into this plan of God to have a place where everyone would belong. And on days that felt really long and really exhausting, and when they wondered why they had left the rest of their family behind, there was one promise that they returned to, that God would bless the world through their family. And when Abram and Sarai were as old as your great-grandparents, they still did not have children. They probably questioned God at times. Was God trustworthy? But God was with them. God was kind and merciful. Don't be afraid, God said. You are never alone. I will bless you. But when? How? I can imagine a very old Abram asking, his voice quiet, perhaps feeling forgotten. We have followed you for so long, but we still don't have children. Look up, God said. See if you can count the stars from here to the horizon. Abram tipped back his head and began to count. 1, 2, 3, 100, 1,000. His eyes grew with wonder as he realized that he could count all night and still never finish. How could God promise with such abundance? How could this be? Like his ancestors before him for generations and generations, God was asking Abram to trust God, to listen to God's voice. And like his ancestors before him, Abram had to make that choice for himself. God had been with them in their travels, even when they made mistakes. God had been faithful, even when they had failed. God had saved them when they were in danger. God had called them even when they didn't quite know where that calling would lead. Even as their circumstances changed, God had been present and faithful. God had given them a place to belong, a people to be. So Abram chose to believe God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Abram's life was fine, good even. Abram was married to Sarai, and sure, life isn't perfect. Maybe it doesn't look exactly like they thought. After all, they had wanted children, and it didn't happen. But they had their family, and they had a role, and they had a purpose. And then God shows up and says to Abram, go. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, God has been with humanity, teaching them and speaking to them. They are building a society and a way of life that honors God within these family units that God created. But something feels a little different here in Genesis 12. God's words to Abram command him to turn his back on his family. He is asked to leave his family, to leave his role as the firstborn son, to leave his role as a patriarch, all in return for an unknown divine blessing. And what feels so significant in this passage is that this is the very beginning of a journey for Abram that will end in a new identity. In a few years, he'll be renamed Abraham, the father of the nations. But that journey begins here as Abram starts to wrestle with who he is and what his role is in the world. Right here in Genesis 12, Abram must start to evaluate who he is and what he values when God shows up and tells him what's going to happen. Abram has to deal with what God is telling him and make some decisions. Because the reality is that God isn't just asking Abraham to move. This is not just a cross-country move, which I also know is really hard. This is leaving behind who Abram is. The entirety of who Abram is wrapped up in his identity with his family. Family roles were really important in the ancient world. Abram had a special role as the eldest son. As the firstborn, he is supposed to carry on his family's name, traditions, wealth, the one who will inherit. He is the patriarch, the top of the line for leadership of the entire family clan. He was supposed to be the power and the stability for his family. But instead of holding on to that role that he was born into, Abram hears this word from God and leaves. Abram doesn't seem to hesitate to leave his family. He leaves the power, the wealth, the security and stability, what the world would call incredible success. And he seems to leave it with what seems to be not a second thought. And I wonder what happened when Abram left. Was his family hurt? Did they feel betrayed? Were they mad that he didn't stick to the plan and fill the role that he was literally born to fulfill? When we hear these words from God to Abraham, we hear a call to get up and go, to leave your family and country and what you know. But some theologians and rabbis look at the Hebrew word used here and interpret it slightly differently. The words that God says to Abram translate to go for yourself. We are taught from childhood that our role in following God is to be selfless, right? That we serve others. So it makes sense that Abram was supposed to stay where he was, fulfilling his role to his family. It's his duty as the oldest son. And honoring family is how you honor God. Perhaps we can make space that if God calls you, this overrides your family duty. After all, it's God and God needs you. So sure, you can leave for that. But God isn't calling Abram to test his faith. God doesn't tell Abram to go for me. What God tells Abram is go for yourself. Go to be yourself. And this sounds like a little different calling than I have imagined that Abram heard for most of my life. If we expand our understanding to God inviting Abram to leave for himself, it can sound selfish. But perhaps what Abram is doing here is following God's call to something different. And if being something different might not please everybody, and definitely not his family. So what happens for Abram when he accepts this call to go? Abram and Sarai leave because God called and that was enough. This may have been the land on which they were born, the land in which they are planted, but they abandon it. In order to find the home and the life that God has for them, the life that God had created for them, they now must wander. They must begin a wilderness journey of their own because they can no longer stay if they want to grow into who God created them to be. And as they begin this journey into the unknown, into the wilderness, they leave behind the weight of everyone's perceptions and judgments. They pack up their bags and their animals and their people, and they leave. Because to truly encounter God with our full selves, we may have to leave the baggage of our lives behind us. This journey that God has invited Abram on is a journey for himself. And Abram steps out in faith even when he can't see the whole path. Abram felt this tug of God, this love and life that was calling him to a journey to the wilderness. And even as he left behind his life to enter the big world of possibility of what was next, Abram still wasn't there. Right now, his identity might feel small. He's no longer who he was, but he also isn't who he will become yet. Because it takes time for Abram to become Abraham. It would take years for him to get this new identity, and quite frankly, Abram is not ready yet. He is not ready to be the father of the nations. He is not ready to have his descendants outnumber the stars in the sky. It takes time trusting God and listening to himself and making choices that will form him into the man that Abraham will be. But right now, he's just Abram, an ex-patriarch wandering in the wilderness, learning to trust the voice that has called him, choosing to believe that what is ahead will be greater than what he left behind. This time of wandering is necessary. This time of wandering is sacred. It's a time of becoming. And perhaps this is what happens to all of us when we encounter God. We detach from who the world would tell us to be so that we might become who God has created us to be. And I wonder if we would have the trust and the courage of Abram when God calls us by name. Do we hear the voice of God? Do we trust God's voice when we hear it? And what would you be willing to leave behind in order to follow that call? Would you leave the expectations of your family? What about your community? Your political party, or the values that you thought defined you, even when they're good? Would you leave your career? When God calls, would you be willing to leave behind stability and comfort of the life that you've built? There are a lot of voices that speak into our lives, and a lot of people and values and ideologies that grasp at who we are and pull us in so many directions. But when we encounter God, we are invited into a journey within ourselves. We are invited to learn who we are and who God is changing us to become. We are invited to hear a voice that would lead us in the wilderness so that we might have the silence to hear the only voice that matters. We are invited to hear not the voices of the world who have expectations and duties and baggage for us to carry, but to hear the voice of God who would call us to be born in God's own image every single day. And we choose to trust that voice, to trust that abundant blessing lies on the other side of the wilderness. That when we choose to leave behind who we thought we were to become who God calls us to be, God will journey with us. So no matter what you leave behind, the expectations of a world that weigh you down, the family who doesn't know how to love you when you long to belong, The work or the power or the money that keeps you in a cage when you long to be free, or even the safety of a life that the world tells you to live. You are invited to encounter God in the wilderness, to spend time walking and walking and walking until your thoughts run out, to spend time wondering about what is next instead of knowing what you are told. You are invited to slowly shed your old skin. You are invited to become strong and brave so that you can face others and maybe even face yourself. You are invited to take the time to grow into a new name. When God calls, may you go for yourself. May you let go of the expectations of the world for the abundance of God. May God use you as you bless the world in ways you never imagined possible. Amen.